The Devil in Manuscript by Nathaniel Hawthorne. On a bitter evening of December, I arrived by mail in a large town, which was then the residence of an intimate friend, one of those gifted youths who cultivate poetry and the belles lettres, and call themselves students at law. My first business, after supper, was to visit him at the office of his distinguished instructor. As I have said, it was a bitter night, clear starlight, but cold as Nova Zembla, the shop windows along the street being frosted so as almost to hide the lights, while the wheels of coaches thundered equally loud over frozen earth and pavements of stone. There was no snow either on the ground or the roofs of the houses. The wind blew so violently that I had but to spread my cloak like a mainsail and scud along the street at the rate of 10 knots, greatly envied by other navigators who were beating slowly up, with the gale right in their teeth. One of these I capsized, but was gone on the wings of the wind before he could even vociferate an oath. After this picture of an inclement night, behold us, seated by a great blazing fire, which looked so comfortable and delicious that I felt inclined to lie down and roll among the hot coals. The usual furniture of a lawyer's office was around us, rows of volumes in sheepskin, and a multitude of writs, summonses, and other legal papers scattered over the desks and tables. But there were certain objects which seemed to intimate that we had little dread of the intrusion of clients, or of the learned counselor himself, who, indeed, was attending court in a distant town. A tall, decanter-shaped bottle stood on the table, between 2 tumblers, and beside a pile of blotted manuscripts, altogether dissimilar to any law documents recognized in our courts. My friend, whom I shall call Oberon, it was a name of fancy and friendship between him and me, my friend Oberon looked at these papers with a peculiar expression of disquietude. "I do believe," said he soberly, "or at least I could believe, if I chose, that there is a devil in this pile of blotted papers. You have read them and know what I mean. That conception in which I endeavored to embody the character of a fiend, as represented in our traditions and the written records of witchcraft. Oh, I have a horror of what was created in my own brain, and shudder at the manuscripts in which I gave that dark idea a sort of material existence. Would they were out of my sight." "And of mine, too," thought I. "You remember," continued Oberon, "how the hellish thing used to suck away the happiness of those who, by a simple concession that seemed almost innocent, subjected themselves to his power. Just so my peace is gone, and all by these accursed manuscripts. Have you felt nothing of the same influence?" "Nothing," replied I, "unless the spell be hid in a desire to turn novelist after reading your delightful tales." "Novelist!" exclaimed Oberon, half seriously. "Then, indeed, my devil has his claw on you. You are gone. You cannot even pray for deliverance. But we will be the last and only victims, for this night I mean to burn the manuscripts and commit the fiend to his retribution in the flames." "Burn your tales?" repeated I, startled at the desperation of the idea. "Even so," said the author despondingly. "You cannot conceive what an effect the composition of these tales has had on me. I have become ambitious of a bubble and careless of solid reputation. I am surrounding myself with shadows which bewilder me by aping the realities of life. They have drawn me aside from the beaten path of the world and led me into a strange sort of solitude. A solitude in the midst of men, where nobody wishes for what I do, nor thinks nor feels as I do. The tales have done all this. When they are ashes, perhaps I shall be as I was before they had existence. Moreover, the sacrifice is less than you may suppose, since nobody will publish them." "That does make a difference, indeed," said I. "They have been offered, by letter," continued Oberon, reddening with vexation, "to some 17 booksellers. It would make you stare to read their answers, and read them you should, only that I burned them as fast as they arrived. One man publishes nothing but school books. Another has 5 novels already under examination." "What a voluminous mass the unpublished literature of America must be," cried I. "Oh, the Alexandrian manuscripts were nothing to it," said my friend. "Well, another gentleman is just giving up business on purpose, I verily believe, to escape publishing my book. Several, however, would not absolutely decline the agency on my advancing half the cost of an edition and giving bonds for the remainder, besides a high percentage to themselves, whether the book sells or not. Another advises a subscription." "The villain!" exclaimed I. "A fact!" said Oberon. "In short, of all the 17 booksellers, only one has vouchsafed even to read my tales, and he, a literary dabbler himself, I should judge, has the impertinence to criticize them, proposing what he calls vast improvements, and concluding, after a general sentence of condemnation, with the definitive assurance that he will not be concerned on any terms." "It might not be amiss to pull that fellow's nose," remarked I. "If the whole trade had one common nose, there would be some satisfaction in pulling it," answered the author. "But there does seem to be one honest man among those 17 unrighteous ones, and he tells me fairly that no American publisher will meddle with an American work. Seldom if by a known writer, and never if by a new one, unless at the writer's risk." "The paltry rogues!" cried I. "Will they live by literature and yet risk nothing for its sake? But, after all, you might publish on your own account." "And so I might," replied Oberon. "But the devil of the business is this. These people have put me so out of conceit with the tales that I loathe the very thought of them, and actually experience a physical sickness of the stomach whenever I glance at them on the table. I tell you, there is a demon in them. I anticipate a wild enjoyment in seeing them in the blaze, such as I should feel in taking vengeance on an enemy or destroying something noxious." I did not strenuously oppose this determination, being privately of opinion, in spite of my partiality for the author, that his tales would make a more brilliant appearance in the fire than anywhere else. Before proceeding to execution, we broached the bottle of champagne which Oberon had provided for keeping up his spirits in this doleful business. We swallowed each a tumblerful in sparkling commotion. It went bubbling down our throats, and brightened my eyes at once, but left my friend sad and heavy as before. He drew the tales toward him with a mixture of natural affection and natural disgust, like a father taking a deformed infant into his arms. "Pooh! Psh! Pshaw!" exclaimed he, holding them at arm's length. "It was Gray's idea of heaven to lounge on a sofa and read new novels. Now, what more appropriate torture would Dante himself have contrived for the sinner who perpetuates a bad book than to be continually turning over the manuscript?" "It would fail of effect," said I, "because a bad author is always his own great admirer." "I lack that one characteristic of my tribe, the only desirable one," observed Oberon. "But how many recollections throng upon me as I turn over these leaves. This scene came into my fancy as I walked along a hilly road on a starlit October evening, in the pure and bracing air. I became all soul, and felt as if I could climb the sky and run a race along the Milky Way. Here is another tale in which I wrapped myself during a dark and dreary night ride in the month of March, till the rattling of the wheels and the voices of my companions seemed like faint sounds of a dream, and my visions a bright reality. That scribbled page describes shadows which I summoned to my bedside at midnight. They would not depart when I bade them. The gray dawn came and found me wide awake and feverish, the victim of my own enchantments." "There must have been a sort of happiness in all this," said I, smitten with a strange longing to make proof of it. "There may be happiness in a fever fit," replied the author, "and then the various moods in which I wrote. Sometimes my ideas were like precious stones under the earth, requiring toil to dig them up and care to polish and brighten them. But often a delicious stream of thought would gush out upon the page at once, like water sparkling up suddenly in the desert. And when it had passed, I gnawed my pen hopelessly or blundered on with cold and miserable toil, as if there were a wall of ice between me and my subject. "Do you now perceive a corresponding difference," inquired I, "between the passages which you wrote so coldly and those fervid flashes of the mind?" "No," said Oberon, tossing the manuscripts on the table. "I find no traces of the golden pen with which I wrote in characters of fire. My treasure of fairy coin is changed to worthless dross. My picture, painted in what seemed the loveliest hues, presents nothing but a faded and indistinguishable surface. I have been eloquent and poetical and humorous in a dream, and behold, it is all nonsense now that I am awake." My friend now threw sticks of wood and dry chips upon the fire, and seeing it blaze like Nebuchadnezzar's furnace, seized the champagne bottle and drank 2 or 3 brimming bumpers successively. The heady liquor combined with his agitation to throw him into a species of rage. He laid violent hands on the tales. In one instant more, their faults and beauties would alike have vanished in a glowing purgatory. But, all at once, I remembered passages of high imagination, deep pathos, original thoughts, and points of such varied excellence that the vastness of the sacrifice struck me most forcibly. I caught his arm. "Surely you do not mean to burn them!" I exclaimed. "Let me alone!" cried Oberon, his eyes flashing fire. "I will burn them! Not a scorched syllable shall escape! Would you have me a damned author, to undergo sneers, taunts, abuse, and cold neglect, and faint praise bestowed for pity's sake against the giver's conscience? A hissing and a laughing stock to my own traitorous thoughts? An outlaw from the protection of the grave, one whose ashes every careless foot might spurn, unhonored in life and remembered scornfully in death? Am I to bear all this when yonder fire will ensure me from the whole? No! There go the tales. May my hand wither when it would write another." The deed was done. He had thrown the manuscripts into the hottest of the fire, which at first seemed to shrink away, but soon curled round them, and made them a part of its own fervent brightness. Oberon stood gazing at the conflagration, and shortly began to soliloquize in the wildest strain, as if fancy resisted and became riotous at the moment when he would have compelled her to ascend that funeral pile. His words described objects which he appeared to discern in the fire, fed by his own precious thoughts. Perhaps the 1,000 visions which the writer's magic had incorporated with these pages became visible to him in the dissolving heat. Bringing forth ere they vanished forever. While the smoke, the vivid sheets of flame, the ruddy and whitening coals caught the aspect of a varied scenery. "They blaze," said he, "as if I had steeped them in the intensest spirit of genius. There I see my lovers clasped in each other's arms. How pure the flame that bursts from their glowing hearts! And yonder the features of a villain writhing in the fire that shall torment him to eternity. My holy men, my pious and angelic women stand like martyrs amid the flames, their mild eyes lifted heavenward. Ring out the bells! A city is on fire! See! Destruction roars through my dark forests, while the lakes boil up in steaming billows, and the mountains are volcanoes, and the sky kindles with a lurid brightness. All elements are but one pervading flame. Ha! The fiend!" I was somewhat startled by this latter exclamation. The tales were almost consumed, but just then threw forth a broad sheet of fire, which flickered as with laughter, making the whole room dance in its brightness, and then roared portentously up the chimney. "You saw him? You must have seen him!" cried Oberon. "How he glared at me and laughed in that last sheet of flame, with just the features that I imagined for him. Well, the tales are gone. The papers were indeed reduced to a heap of black cinders, with a multitude of sparks hurrying confusedly among them, the traces of the pen being now represented by white lines, and the whole mass fluttering to and fro in the draughts of air. The destroyer knelt down to look at them. "What is more potent than fire?" said he in his gloomiest tone. "Even thought, invisible and incorporeal as it is, cannot escape it. In this little time, it has annihilated the creations of long nights and days, which I could no more reproduce in their first glow and freshness than cause ashes and whitened bones to rise up and live. There, too, I sacrificed the unborn children of my mind. All that I had accomplished, all that I planned for future years, has perished by one common ruin, and left only this heap of embers. The deed has been my fate. And what remains? A weary and aimless life, a long repentance of this hour, and at last an obscure grave where they will bury and forget me." As the author concluded his dolorous moan, the extinguished embers arose and settled down, and arose again, and finally flew up the chimney like a demon with sable wings. Just as they disappeared, there was a loud and solitary cry in the street below us. "Fire! Fire!" Other voices caught up that terrible word, and it speedily became the shout of a multitude. Oberon started to his feet in fresh excitement. "A fire on such a night?" cried he. "The wind blows a gale, and wherever it whirls the flames, the roofs will flash up like gunpowder. Every pump is frozen up, and boiling water would turn to ice the moment it was flung from the engine. In an hour, this wooden town will be one great bonfire. What a glorious scene for my next—" Pfft! The street was now all alive with footsteps, and the air full of voices. We heard one engine thundering round a corner, and another rattling from a distance over the pavements. The bells of 3 steeples clanged out at once, spreading the alarm to many a neighboring town, and expressing hurry, confusion, and terror so inimitably that I could almost distinguish in their peal the burden of the universal cry, "Fire! Fire! Fire!" "What is so eloquent as their iron tongues?" exclaimed Oberon. "My heart leaps and trembles, but not with fear. And that other sound, too, deep and awful as a mighty organ, the roar and thunder of the multitude on the pavement below. Come, we are losing time. I will cry out in the loudest of the uproar, and mingle my spirit with the wildest of the confusion, and be a bubble on the top of the ferment." From the first outcry, my forebodings had warned me of the true object and center of alarm. There was nothing now but uproar, above, beneath, and around us. Footsteps stumbling pell-mell up the public staircase, eager shouts and heavy thumps at the door, the whiz and dash of water from the engines, and the crash of furniture thrown upon the pavement. At once the truth flashed upon my friend. His frenzy took the hue of joy, and, with a wild gesture of exultation, he leaped almost to the ceiling of the chamber. "My tales!" cried Oberon. "The chimney! The roof! The fiend has gone forth by night and startled thousands in fear and wonder from their beds. Here I stand, a triumphant author. Huzzah! Huzzah! My brain has set the town on fire. Ha ha!
His Other Self by W. W. Jacobs. "They're like as 2 peas, him and his brother," said the night watchman, gazing blandly at the indignant face of the lighterman on the barge below. "And the only way I know this one is Sam is because Bill don't use bad language. Twins they are, but the likeness is only outside. Bill's heart is as white as snow." He got off a plug of tobacco and, placing it in his cheek, waited expectantly. "White as snow," he repeated. "That's me," said the lighterman, as he pushed his unwieldy craft from the jetty. "I'll tell Sam your opinion of him. So long." The watchman went a shade redder than usual. "That's twins all over," he said sourly, "always deceiving people. It's Bill arter all. and instead of hurting his feelings, I've just been flattering of him up. It ain't the first time I've had trouble over a likeness. I've been a twin myself, in a manner of speaking. It didn't last long, but it lasted long enough for me to always be sorry for twins, and to make a lot of allowance for them. It must be very hard to have another man going about with your face on his shoulders and getting it into trouble. It was a year or two ago now. I was sitting one evening at the gate, smoking a pipe and looking at a newspaper I'd found in the office, when I see a gentleman coming along from the swing bridge. Well-dressed, clean-shaved chap he was, smoking a cigarette. He was walking slow and looking about him casual-like, until his eyes fell on me, when he gave a perfect jump of surprise, and after looking at me very hard, walked on a little way and then turned back. He did it twice, and I was just going to say something to him, something I'd been getting ready for him, when he spoke to me. "Good evening," he says. "Good evening," I says, folding the paper over and looking at him rather severe. "I hope you'll excuse me staring," he says, very polite, "but I've never seen such a face and figure as yours in all my life. Never." "Ah, you ought to have seen me a few years ago," I says. "I'm like everybody else. I'm getting on." "Rubbish," he says. "You couldn't be better if you tried. It's marvellous. Wonderful. It's the very thing I've been looking for. Why, if you'd been made to order, you couldn't have been better." I thought at first he was by way of trying to get a drink out of me. I've been played that game afore. But instead of that, he asked me whether I'd do him the pleasure of having one with him. We went over to the Albion, and I believe I could have had it in a pail if I'd only liked to say the word. And all the time I was drinking, he was looking me up and down, till I didn't know where to look, as the saying is. "I came down here to look for somebody like you," he says, "but I never dreamt I should have such luck as this. I'm an actor, and I've got to play the part of a sailor, and I've been worried some time how to make up for the part. Do you understand?" "No," I says, looking at him. "I want to look the real thing," he says, speaking low so the landlord shouldn't hear. "I want to make myself the living image of you. If that don't fetch 'em, I'll give up the stage and grow cabbages." "Make yourself like me?" I says. "Why, you're no more like me than I'm like a seasick monkey." "Not so much," he says. "That's where the art comes in." He stood me another drink, and then, taking my arm in a cuddling sort of way, and calling me dear boy, he led me back to the wharf and explained. He said he would come round next evening with what he called his make-up box, and paint his face and make himself up till people wouldn't know one from the other. "And what about your figure?" I said, looking at him. "Well, a cushion," he says, winking, "or maybe a couple." "And what about clothes? You'll have to sell me those you've got on, hat and all, and boots." I put a price on 'em that I thought would have finished him then and there, but it didn't, and at last, after paying me so many more compliments that they began to get into my head, he fixed up a meeting for the next night and went off. "And mind," he says, coming back, "not a word to a living soul." He went off again, and after going to the Bull's Head and having a pint to clear my head, I went and sat down in the office and thought it over. It seemed all right to me as far as I could see. But perhaps the pint didn't clear my head enough. Perhaps I ought to have had 2 pints. I lay awake, best part of the next day, thinking it over, and when I got up, I'd made up my mind. I put my clothes in a sack, and then I put on some others, so as much like 'em as possible, only perhaps a bit older, in case the missus should get asking questions. And then I sat wondering how to get out with the sack without her noticing it. She's got a very inquiring mind, and I wasn't going to tell her any lies about it, besides which I couldn't think of one. I got out at last by playing a game on her. I pretended to drop $50 in the wash-house, and while she was busy on her hands and knees, I went off as comfortable as you please. I got into the office with it all right, and just as it was getting dark, a cab drove up to the wharf, and the actor chap jumped out with a big leather bag. I took him into the private office, and he was so ready with his money for the clothes that I offered to throw the sack in. He changed into my clothes first of all, and then, asking me to sit down in front of him, he took a looking-glass and a box out of his bag and began to alter his face. What with sticks, coloured paint and false out eyebrows and a beard stuck on with gum and trimmed with a pair of scissors. It was more like a conjuring trick than anything else. Then he took a wig out of his bag and pressed it on his head, put on the cap, put some black stuff on his teeth, and there he was. We both looked into the glass together while he gave the finishing touches, and then he clapped me on the back and said I was the handsomest sailor man in England. I shall have to make up a bit heavier for when I'm behind the floats, he says, but this is enough for here. What do you think of the imitation of your voice? I think I've got it exact. If you ask me, I says, it sounds like a poll parrot with a cold in the head. And now for your walk, he says, looking as pleased as if I'd said something else. Come to the door and see me go up the wharf. I didn't like to hurt his feelings, but I thought I should have bust. He walked up that wharf like a dancing bear in a pair of trousers too tight for it. But he was so pleased with himself that I didn't like to tell him so. He went up and down 2 or 3 times, and I never saw anything so ridiculous in my life. It's all very well for us, he says, but what about other people? That's what I want to know. I'll go and have a drink and see whether anybody spots me. Before I could stop him, he started off to the Bull's Head and went in, while I stood outside and watched him. Half a pint of 4 ale, he says, smacking down a penny. I see the landlord draw the beer and give it to him, but he didn't seem to take no notice of him. Then, just to open his eyes a bit, I walked in and put down a penny and asked for half a pint. The landlord was just wiping down the counter at the time, and when I gave my order, he looked up and stood staring at me with the wet cloth held up in the air. He didn't say a word, not a single word. He stood there for a moment, smiling at us, foolish-like, and then he let go of the beer engine what he was holding in his left hand and sat down heavy on the bar floor. We both put our heads over the counter to see what had happened to him, and he started making the most horrible noise I have ever heard in my life. I wonder it didn't bring the fire engines. The actor chap bolted out as if he'd been shot, and I was just thinking of following him when the landlord's wife and his 2 daughters came rushing out and asking me what I'd done to him. There was 2 of him, says the landlord, trembling and holding on to his wife's arm as they helped him and got him in the chair. 2 of him! 2 of what? Says his wife. 2 watchmen, says the landlord, both exactly alike, and both asking for half a pint of 4 ale. Yes, says his wife. You come and lay down, Pa, says the gals. I tell you, there was, says the landlord, getting his colour back, with temper. Yes, I know all about it, says his wife. You come inside for a bit, and Gertie, you bring your father in a soda, a large soda. They got him in after a lot of trouble, but 3 times he came back as far as the door, holding on to them and taking a little peep at me. The last time he shook his head at me and said if I did it again, I could go and get my half pint somewhere else. I finished the beer what the actor had left, and after telling the landlord I hoped his eyesight would be better in the morning, I went outside, and after a careful look around, walked back to the wharf. I pushed the wicket open a little way and peeped in. The actor was standing just by the first crane, talking to 2 of the hands off of the Saltram. He'd got his back to the light, but how it was they didn't twig his voice, I can't think. They were so busy talking that I crept along by the side of the wall and got to the office without their seeing me. I went into the private office and turned out the gas there and sat down to wait for him. Then I heard a noise outside that took me to the door again and kept me there, holding on to the doorpost and gasping for me breath. The cook of the Saltram was sitting on a paraffin cask playing the mouth organ, and the actor, with his arms folded across his stomach, was dancing a hornpipe as if he'd gone mad. I never saw anything so ridiculous in my life, and when I recollected that they thought it was me, I thought I should have dropped. A night watchman can't be too careful, and I knew that it'd be all over Wapping next morning that I'd been dancing to a tuppenny-halfpenny mouth organ played by a ship's cook. A man that does his duty always has a lot of people ready to believe the worst of him. I went back into the dark office and waited, and by I heard him coming along to the gate and patting him on the back and saying he ought to be in a pantomime instead of wasting his time night watching. He left him at the gate, and then he came into the office, smiling as if he'd done something clever. "What do you think of me for an understudy?" he says, laughing. "They all thought it was you. There wasn't one of 'em had the slightest suspicion. Not one." "And what about my character?" I says, folding my arms across my chest and looking at him. "Character?" he says, staring. "Why, there's no harm in dancing. It's an innocent enjoyment." "It ain't one of my innocent enjoyments," I says, "and I don't want the credit of it. If they ain't been sitting in a pub all evening, they'd have spotted you at once." "Oh," he says, very huffy. "How?" "Your voice," I says. "You try and mimic a poll parrot and think it's like me. And for another thing, you walk about as though you're stuffed with sawdust." "I beg your pardon," he says. "The voice and the walk are exact. Exact." "What?" I says, looking him up and down. "You stand there and have the impudence to tell me that my voice is like that?" "I do," he says. "Then I'm sorry for you," I says. "I thought you'd got more sense." He stood looking at me and gnawing his finger, and by the by, he says, "Oh, you married?" he says. "I am," I says, very short. "Where do you live?" he says. I told him. "Very good," he says. "Perhaps I'll be able to convince you after all. By the way, what do you call your wife? Mrs.?" "Yes," I says, staring at him. "But what's it got to do with you?" "Nothing," he says. "Nothing. Only I'm going to try the pale potted voice and the sawdust walk on her, that's all. If I can deceive her, that'll settle it." "Deceive her?" I says. "Do you think I'm going to let you go round to my house and get me into trouble with my missus like that? Why, you must be crazy. That dancing must have got into your head." "Where's the harm?" he says, very sulky. "Harm?" I says. "I won't have it, that's all. And if you knew my missus, you'd know without any telling." "I'll bet you £1 to a sixpence she wouldn't know me," he says, very earnest. "She won't have the chance," I says, "so that's all about it." He stood there argufying for about 10 minutes, but I was firm as a rock. I wouldn't move an inch, and at last, after we was both on the point of losing our tempers, he picked up his bag and said as how he must be getting off home. "But ain't you going to take those things off first?" I says. "No," he says, smiling. "I'll wait till I get home. Ta-ta." He put his bag on his shoulder and walked to the gate, with me following of him. "I expect I shall see a cab soon," he says. "Goodbye." "What are you laughing at?" I says. "Only thoughts," he says. "Have you got far to go?" I says. "No, just about the same distance as you have," he says, and he went off, spluttering like a soda water bottle. I took the broom and had a good sweep up after he'd gone, and I was just in the middle of it, when the cook and the other 2 chaps from the Saltram came back with 3 other sailormen and a brewer's drayman they had brought to see me dance. "Same as you did a little while ago, Bill," says the cook, taking out his beastly mouth organ and wiping it on his sleeve. "What tune would you like?" I couldn't get away from 'em, and when I told them I'd never danced in my life, the cook asked me where I expected to go to. He told the drayman that I'd been dancing like a fairy in sea boots, and they all got in front of me and wouldn't let me pass. I lost my temper at last, and after they'd taken the broom away from me, and the drayman and one of the sailormen had said what they'd do to me if I was only 50 years younger, they sheered off. I locked the gate after them, and went back to the office, and I hadn't been there above half an hour when somebody started ringing the gate bell as if they was mad. I thought it was the cook's lot come back at first, so I opened the wicket just a trifle and peered out. There was an hansom cab standing outside, and I'd hardly got my nose to the crack when the actor chap, still in my clothes, pushed the door open and nipped in. "You've lost," he says, pushing the door to and smiling all over. "Where's your sixpence?" "Lost?" I says, hardly able to speak. "Do you mean to tell me you've been to my wife after all I said to you?" "I do," he says, nodding and smiling again. "They were both deceived, as easy as easy." "Both?" I says, staring at him. "Both what? How many wives do you think I've got? What do you mean by it?" "After I left you," he says, giving me a little poke in the ribs, "I picked up a cab, and first, leaving my bag at Aldgate, I drove on to your house and knocked at the door. I knocked twice, and then an angry-looking woman opened it and asked me what I wanted. 'It's all right, missus,' I says. 'I got half an hour off. and I've come to take you out for a walk." "What?" she says, drawing back with a start. "Just a little turn round to see the shops," I says, "and if there's anything in particular you'd like and it don't cost too much, you shall have it." I thought at first from the way she took it she wasn't used to you giving her things. "How dare you?" she says. "I'll have you locked up. How dare you insult a respectable married woman? You wait till my husband comes home." "But I am your husband," I says. "Don't you know me, my pretty? Don't you know your pet sailor boy?" She gave a screech like a steam engine, and then she went next door and began knocking away like mad. Then I see that I'd gone to number 12 instead of number 14. Your real wife, came out to number 14, and she was worse than the other. But they both thought it was you, there's no doubt of that. They chased me all the way up the road, and if it hadn't been for this cab that was just passing, I don't know what would have happened to me." He shook his head and smiled again, and after opening the wicket a trifle and telling the cabman he shouldn't be long, he turned to me and asked me for the sixpence to wear on his watch chain. "Sixpence?" I says. "Sixpence? What do you think is going to happen to me when I go home?" "Oh, I hadn't thought of that," he says. "Yes, of course." "What about my wife's jealousy?" I says. "What about the other and her husband, a cooper as big as an house?" Well, he says, "one can't think of everything. It'll be all the same 100 years hence. Look here," I says, taking his shoulder in a grip of iron. "You come back with me now in that cab and explain. D'ye see? That's what you've got to do." "All right," he says, "certainly. Is the husband bad-tempered?" "You'll see," I says, "but that's your business. Come along." "With pleasure," he says, helping me in. "Half a mo' while I tell the cabby where to drive to." He went back to the back of the cab, and afore I knew what had happened, the horse had got a flick over the head with the whip and was going along at a gallop. I kept putting the little flap up and telling the cabby to stop, but he didn't take the slightest notice. After I'd done it 3 times, he kept it down so I couldn't open it. There was a crowd round my door when the cab drove up, and in the middle of it was my missus, the woman next door, and her husband what had just come home. Half a dozen of 'em helped me out, and before I could say a word, the cabman drove off and left me there. I dream of it now sometimes, standing there explaining and explaining until, just as I feel I can't bear it any longer, 2 policemen come up and helped me indoors. If they had helped my missus outside, it would be an easier dream to have.
The Barn on the Marsh by Charles G.D. Roberts. It had not always stood on the marsh. When I was a little boy of 7, it occupied the rear of our neighbour's yard, not a stone's throw from the rectory gate, on one of the windy, sunshiny spurs of South Mountain. A perpetual eyesore to the rector, but I cannot help thinking, as I view it now in the concentrated light of memory, that it did artistic service in the way of a foil to the loveliness of the rectory garden. This garden was the rector's delight, but to my restless 7 years it was a sort of gay-coloured and ever-threatening bugbear. Weeding, and especially such thorough, radical weeding as alone would satisfy the rector's conscience, was my detestation, and, moreover, just at the time of being called upon to weed, there was sure to be something else of engrossing importance which my nimble little wits had set themselves upon doing. But I never found courage to betray my lack of sympathy in all its iciness. The sight of the rector's enthusiasm filled me ever with a sense of guilt, and I used to weed quite diligently, at times. One morning the rector had lured me out early, before breakfast, while the sun yet hung low above the shining marshes. We were working cheerfully together at the carrot beds. The smell of the moist earth and of the dewy young carrot plants, bruised by my hasty fingers, comes vividly upon my senses even now. Suddenly I heard the rector cry, "Bother!" in a tone which spoke volumes. I saw he had broken his hoe short off at the handle. I stopped work with alacrity, and gazed with commiserating interest while I began wiping my muddy little fingers on my knickerbockers, in bright anticipation of some new departure which should put a pause to the weeding. In a moment or two the vexed wrinkles smoothed themselves out of the rector's brow, and he turned to me with the proposal that we should go over to our neighbours and repair the damage. One end of the barn, as we knew, was used for a workshop. We crossed the road, let down the bars, put to flight a flock of pigeons that were feeding among the scattered straw, and threw open the big barn doors. There, just inside, hung the dead body of our neighbour, his face distorted and purple. And, while I stood sobbing with horror, the rector cut him down with the draw knife which he had come to borrow. Soon after this tragedy, the barn was moved down to the marsh, to be used for storing hay and farm implements. And by the time the scene had faded from my mind, the rector gave up the dear delights of his garden, and took us off to a distant city parish. Not until I had reached 18, and the dignity of college cap and gown, did I revisit the salty breezes of South Mountain. Then I came to see friends who were living in the old rectory. About 2 miles away, by the main road, dwelt certain other friends with whom I was given to spending most of my evenings, and who possessed some strange charm which would never permit me to say good night at anything like a seasonable hour. The distance, as I said, to these friends was about 2 miles, if you followed the main road, but there was a short cut, a road across the marsh, used chiefly by the haymakers and the fishermen, not pleasant to travel in wet weather, but good enough for me at all times in the frame of mind in which I found myself. This road, on either hand, was bordered by a high rail fence, along which rose, here and there, the bleak spire of a ghostly and perishing Lombardy poplar. This is the tree of all least suited to those wind-beaten regions, but none other will the country people plant. Close up to the road, at one point, curved a massive sweep of red dyke, and further to the right stretched the miles on miles of naked marsh, till they lost themselves in the lonely, shifting waters of the basin. About 20 paces back from the fence, with its big doors opening toward the road, a conspicuous landmark in all my nightly walks, stood the barn. I remembered vividly enough, but in a remote, impersonal sort of way, the scene on that far-off sunny summer morning. As, night after night, I swung past the ancient doors, my brain in a pleasant confusion, I never gave the remembrance any heed. Finally, I ceased to recall it, and the rattling of the wind in the time-warped shingles fell on utterly careless ears. One night, as I started homeward upon the verge of 12, the marsh seemed all alive with flying gleams. The moon was past the full, white and high. The sky was thick with small black clouds, streaming dizzily across the moon's face, and a moist wind piped steadily in from the sea. I was walking swiftly, not much alive to outward impressions, scarce noticing even the strange play of the moon shadows over the marshes, and had got perhaps a stone's throw past the barn, when a creeping sensation about my skin and a thrill of nervous apprehension made me stop suddenly and take a look behind. The impulse seized me unawares, or I should have laughed at myself and gone on without yielding to such a weakness. But it was too late. My gaze darted unerringly to the barn, whose great doors stood wide open. There, swaying almost imperceptibly in the wind, hung the body of our neighbour, as I had seen it that dreadful morning long ago. For a moment I could hear again my childish sobs, and the remembrance of that horror filled me with self-pity. Then, as the roots of my hair began to stir, my feet set themselves instinctively for flight. This instinct, however, I promptly and sternly repressed. I knew all about these optical illusions, and tried to congratulate myself on this opportunity for investigating one so interesting and vivid. At the same time I gave a hasty side thought to what would have happened had I been one of the superstitious farm hands or fishermen of the district. I should have taken to my heels in desperate terror, and been ever after faithfully persuaded of having looked upon a veritable ghost. I said to myself that the apparition, if I looked upon it steadfastly, would vanish as I approached, or, more probably, resolve itself into some chance combination of moonlight and shadows. In fact, my reason was perfectly satisfied that the ghostly vision was due solely to the association of ideas. I was fresh from my classes in philosophy, aided and abetted by my own pretty vivid imagination. Yet the natural man, this physical being of mine, revolted in every fibre of the flesh from any closer acquaintance with the thing. I began, with reluctant feet, to retrace my steps, but as I did so the vision only grew so much the clearer, and a cold perspiration broke out upon me. Step by step I approached, till I stood just outside the fence, face to face with the apparition. I leaned against the fence, looking through between the rails. And now, at this distance, every feature came out with awful distinctness, all so horrible in its distortion that I cannot bear to describe it. As each fresh gust of wind hissed through the chinks, I could see the body swing before it heavily and slowly. I had to bring all my philosophy to bear, else my feet would have carried me off in a frenzy of flight. At last I reached the conclusion that since my sight was so helplessly deceived, I should have to depend upon the touch. In no other way could I detect the true basis of the illusion. And this way was a hard one. By much argument and self-persuasion I prevailed upon myself to climb the fence, and with a sort of despairing doggedness to let myself down on the inside. Just then the clouds thickened over the face of the moon, and the light faded rapidly. To get down inside the fence with that thing was, for a moment, simply sickening, and my eyes dilated with the intensity of my stare. Then common sense came to the rescue with a revulsion of feeling, and I laughed, though not very mirthfully, at the thoroughness of my scare. With an assumption of coolness and defiance I walked right up to the open doors. And when so close that I could have touched it with my walking stick, the thing swayed gently and faced me in the light of the reappearing moon. Could my eyes deceive me? It certainly was our neighbour. Scarcely knowing what I did, I thrust out my stick and touched it, shrinking back as I did so. What I touched, plain instantly to my sight, was a piece of wood and iron, some portion of a mowing machine or reaper, which had been, apparently, repainted and hung up across the door-pole to dry. It swayed in the wind. The straying fingers of the moonbeams through the chinks pencilled it strangely, and the shadows were huddled black behind it. But now it hung revealed, with no more likeness to a human body than any average well-meaning farm implement might be expected to have. With a huge sigh of relief I turned away. As I climbed the fence once more I gave a parting glance toward the yawning doorway of the barn on the marsh. There, as plain as before I had pierced the bubble, swung the body of my neighbour. And all the way home, though I would not turn my head, I felt it at my heels.
Letters of the late Lord Littleton. Letter 39, 1807. Letter 39. Much of the disputes and consequently many of the inconveniencies of this world, arise from the strange difficulty, for a strange one it is, that men find in understanding each other's meaning. Hence the never-ending game of cross-purposes, in which all of us, at times, are so much engaged. A leading cause of this disunion is a negligence in using terms appropriate to their object. The philosopher, it is true, must generalize his ideas to compass the views of his inquiring mind. It is by such an application of his intellectual facilities that he surmounts such a variety of obstacles, that he passes from individual man to a whole people, from a people to the human race, from the time in which he lives to the ages that are to come, from what he sees to that which is invisible. But in conveying the fruits of his study and reflection to others, he must condescend to weigh words, compare terms, and preclude all possibility of error in those he instructs, by using a simplicity of definition, a perspicuity of expression, where the barrenness of language denies the immediate term, a neatness of paraphrase, which not only invites, but creates conception. You are pleased, in your last letter, to charge the present age with the crime of skepticism, and you have abandoned yourself to a more than common energy on the subject. To tell you the truth, I do not very clearly perceive the tendency of your accusation. If it alludes to religion, you would, I think, find some difficulty to maintain your position. If it should glance at politics, our national submission is certainly against you. Or, leaving the higher concerns of the world, if you should apply your assertion to the ordinary intercourse and common transactions between man and man, you are truly unfortunate, as an extreme gullibility seems to be one of the leading features of the present times. The age in which we live does not possess so great a share, as former centuries, of that faith which is able to remove mountains. Blind credulity, by the insults it so long offered to reason, has in a great measure destroyed itself, or has rather become modified into that sobriety of belief which is consistent with a rational being. The gaudy, awful, and presuming phantom of papal authority has long begun to disappear. That blazing meteor, for which so many ages dazzled the superstitious world, verges toward the horizon, and grows pale before the steady, embodied light of liberal, unimpeded science. But I cannot believe, although luxury and dissipation, with their concomitant depravities, have made such enormous strides among the higher orders, that infidelity in religious matters is a leading characteristic of our times. If we turn from the Church to the State, the firm confidence of a very great majority of the people in a government, which, I am forced to confess, does not possess all the wisdom that such a government ought to possess, is a circumstance which, were I to enlarge upon it, you would be perplexed to answer. In the ordinary transactions of life, the wantonness of commercial credit is well prepared to give the lie direct to any charge of incredulity. Ask Foley, Charles Fox, and 1,000 others what they think of modern infidelity, and they will tell you that the Jews themselves, that unbelieving race, have deserted from the standard of skepticism, and having borne the stigma of spiritual unbelief for upwards of 1,700 years, are at this moment groaning beneath the effects of temporal credulity. Credula turba sumus. We are a credulous race of beings, and the most steady professors of skepticism are deceived by others, and deceive themselves, every hour of the day. Religion, which commands, among its evident truths, the belief of matters which we cannot entirely comprehend, will sometimes so habituate the mind of its submissive disciple to acts of faith, that he does not know how to withhold his assent to the most improbable fictions of human fancy, and the credo quia impossibile est of Tertullian is readily adopted by his yielding piety. I shall confirm the truth of this observation by a story which I have heard related, and is not more extraordinary in its nature than the tone, look, and language of belief which accompanied the relation. A traveler, benighted in a wild and mountainous country, if my recollection does not fail me, in the Highlands of Scotland, at length beholds the welcoming light of a neighboring habitation. He urges his horse toward it, when, instead of a house, he approached a kind of illuminated chapel, from whence issued the most alarming sounds he had ever heard. Though greatly surprised and terrified, he ventured to look through a window of the building, when he was amazed to see a large assembly of cats, who, arranged in solemn order, were lamenting over the corpse of one of their own species, which lay in state, and which was surrounded with the various emblems of sovereignty. Alarmed and terrified at this extraordinary spectacle, he hastened from the place with greater eagerness than he approached it, and arriving some time after at the house of a gentleman who never turned the wanderer from his gate, the impressions of what he had seen were so visible on his countenance that his friendly host inquired into the cause of his anxiety. He accordingly told his story, and having finished it, a large family cat, who had lain during the narrative before the fire, immediately started up and very articulately exclaimed, "Then I am king of the cats!" And having thus announced its new dignity, the animal darted up the chimney and was seen no more. Now the man who seriously repeated this strange and singular history was a peer of the realm, had been concerned in the active scenes of life, and was held in high esteem and veneration among mankind for his talents, wisdom, and Christian piety. After this information, which I give you as a serious fact, what have you to say? It is impossible, but you must immediately withdraw your charge of infidelity against a period which could produce one such implicit believer. As for myself, I will readily confess to you that I am neither a skeptic nor a believer. I have enough of skepticism to prevent the throwing my share of faith away. At the same time, I feel within me that there is something, which I cannot very well explain, the belief whereof I ought to cultivate, and from whence I should derive much satisfaction and contentment, could I but frame my mind to the purpose. If, however, after all my reasoning, you should still continue to fix a skeptical character upon the present age, I trust that you will at least discard it from your own breast, while I assure you of the great regard with which I am your most sincere, humble servant.